By the time you're watching this, the remake of Silent Hill 2, which is being developed by Team Bloober, is less than 2 months from its expected release date of fall of 2023. So nothing that I say here can possibly change the game at this point. But there has been something that has been nagging at the back of my brain since the first trailer for the remake was released, and I've so far been hesitant to talk about it publicly. But I've hit a bit of a lull in my content creation, and I need something to create and put out, so I'm finally going to share this a little more publicly. I've already posted this concern in response to some Reddit threads, and maybe also some other online forums or YouTube comments, so some of you may have already read this particular concern coming from me. Plenty of people all over the internet have already expressed their general concern for Bloober's ability to adequately adapt Silent Hill 2. And I have seen a few others who have shared this particular concern in places like Reddit threads. But since most of the content about Bloober's Silent Hill 2 is focused on their historically awful and toxic depictions of mental health and trauma, I haven't seen a whole lot of content addressed at this particular concern that I want to make here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my thoughts. First and foremost, this video is going to be about the story and the ending of the original Silent Hill 2. It will also include speculation regarding whether Bloober will change this ending or somehow botch its execution. As far as I'm concerned, the announcement trailer has already shown that it will be one or the other, a changed ending or a botched ending. But in any case, if you haven't played Silent Hill 2 before and don't want to be spoiled, then don't watch this video. You've been warned. But even if you do decide not to watch and you haven't already closed the video, you could still maybe consider supporting the creation of content like this on Patreon. I've fallen behind in my content creation, so I'm making this video as a hopefully short project to fill the gap before the next larger project is published. There's already a preview of my plans for my next few projects available on Patrons, and I'll probably be uploading exclusive preview clips as soon as any are ready. Well, if that spoiler warning didn't scare people off, surely the Patreon plug did. So, for anyone who's left, let's talk a little bit about the opening scene of Silent Hill 2, how it relates to the game's ending, how the same ending is depicted in the remake trailer, and what the changes to that scene mean for the ending of the remake.
Could she really be here, waiting for me?
Silent Hill 2 opens as such. A mostly calm and collected James Sunderland is staring at himself in a dirty bathroom mirror, taking in a deep breath, and then walking out to a scenic overlook to explain the premise of the game to the players. He got a letter from his dead wife, who died of a terminal illness 3 years prior. The letter says that she's alive and waiting for him in Silent Hill. He knows it can't possibly be true. But if there's any chance that she is somehow still alive, he has to know. This opening shows us a James who is supposedly 3 years removed from the death of his wife. He isn't necessarily still grieving anymore, but he doesn't seem to have completely moved on either. Otherwise, why would he be here? Regardless, he is completely surprised by this letter and is in a state of disbelief. This is a subtle, subdued opening that gives the player little reason not to take this all at face value. And it goes on to follow this up with a slow burn opening act into the game, in which James strolls casually through a wooded path along the lake and doesn't encounter anything overtly scary for a good 20 or 30 minutes, depending on the pace at which the player is going. This helps to put the player in the same headspace as James. We are just as confused, surprised, and curious as him, but with that nagging certainty that all must not be as it seems. This allows the player to effectively roleplay as James in good faith, and it sets up the game's eventual twist, and also sets a relatively clean slate for the various ending triggers. The player does not see James as anything other than a confused husband, desperately hoping to see his dead wife again, which is a perfectly relatable motive. And the player is able to play James as such, and how you roleplay as James will inform how he eventually deals with the game's twist revelation. But the game will be slowly pulling the rug out from under James and the player, gradually establishing James as being an unreliable narrator. or unreliable avatar, or unreliable point of view, or whatever you want to call the video game equivalent of an unreliable narrator. I don't think we have a formal term for that in video game discourse yet. And considering the additional context that this is a sequel to Silent Hill, which was about a father trying to rescue his daughter from a demonic cult, players of the original sequel may have had even less reason to not trust James. They have no clue that this game is going to be an introspective and metaphorical tale that is almost completely divorced from the first game's plot. They just know that it has a number 2 at the end of the title, so it probably follows from the story of its predecessor. Maybe Mary really is alive, maybe she's another vessel for the cult's demonic god, or maybe her soul was also split and there's a psychic Mary doppelganger living in Silent Hill who is summoning James to help her stop the cult's plans, just like Alessa did. Or maybe she's trying to trick James into helping the cult. And hey, guess what? A few hours into the game, we do indeed meet a Mary doppelganger. Based on the opening minutes of the game, Silent Hill 2 can go in a lot of potential different directions, either introspective, supernatural, occult-driven, or all of the above. Now, let's compare this to the opening scene of the remake, as shown in the trailer. The remake opening appears that it will show a nervous and discombobulated James bursting into that same bathroom in a huff, holding and rubbing his hands like Lady Macbeth herself. Then he looks up at the mirror, the camera fades to black, and when it fades back in, James has apparently done a hard reset, and we see him in a state similar to he was in at the beginning of the original game. This is anything but subtle or subdued. It is clear right from the start that James is undergoing some kind of recent stress or trauma. He's not dealing with grief from 3 years ago. And the rubbing of his hands, which is a clear allusion to Lady Macbeth trying to scrub imaginary blood from her hands in order to satiate her guilt over a murder, is kind of a dead giveaway that the obvious trauma that James is suffering from is guilt from a murder. This hard reset is also a dead giveaway that James is suddenly repressing that trauma and guilt, which is something that previously had been a mid to late game revelation. This remade opening completely gives away, right from the first seconds of the opening cutscene, that James is an unreliable narrator, and that the player cannot take anything that happens from this moment on at face value. James just suffered a traumatic experience, something for which he feels guilty, and something that was clearly violent, since he is metaphorically washing the blood from his hands in the bathroom sink. And when he immediately starts talking about his wife being dead, gee, I wonder what he feels guilty for.
Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago.
Hell, this isn't even the game spoiling its own ending, because the game isn't even out yet. This is the announcement trailer potentially spoiling the ending. Now, sure, I'm looking at this with full knowledge of the original game story, so I'm going to be more inclined to pick up on these details and immediately understand their meaning in context of the original game. It's possible that all this slipped past audiences who have little to no knowledge of the original game and its endings, but even so, it still immediately gives away the unreliable narrator, and that this is a story about some kind of guilt and trauma. Further, since Konami didn't bother with a remake of the first Silent Hill, nor have they, to my knowledge, ever re-released the original PlayStation 1 Silent Hill in a digital format that is playable on newer consoles, new audiences simply don't have any preconceived notions about what this story, as a probable continuation of the previous story, should be about. All they have to go on is this guy bursting into the bathroom and going all Lady Macbeth. And this is all just from the opening scene of the trailer, which is presumably going to be the opening scene of the game. This is to say nothing about questionable content in the rest of the trailer or in screenshots, or the change from third-person and cinematic camera angles to an over-the-shoulder perspective that will make it harder to frame important details outside of cutscenes, make it harder to conceal details of the environment from the player, and make it harder to maintain the claustrophobic atmosphere of the original game, let alone how it will almost certainly necessitate a greater focus on combat and probably gunplay, and the implications that might have on one specific ending and on the overall mood of the whole game. What this means is that if Bloober is trying to retain the original story and endings, they have already failed, because they've given away the twist in the announcement trailer. And, okay, to be fair to Bloober, maybe that's not their fault, maybe that's Konami's fault, but either way, if this scene is in the final game as it is shown in the trailer, they've botched the ending. Players simply are not going to trust James, knowing right from the start that he's an unreliable narrator. And they sure as heck aren't going to be able to roleplay him in good faith as an innocent, grieving husband, knowing right from the start that he is repressing some traumatic guilt. None of the game's other metaphors, symbols, foreshadowing, or ending triggers are going to be meaningful in this remake if it is a direct adaptation of the original game's story. Of course, the other possibility is that Bloober is planning on dramatically changing the story and ending of Silent Hill 2, and that this opening is therefore a misdirection or a clue as to that new story. And, oh boy, that opens up a whole other can of worms. I'm not going to recount here all the ways that Bloober has poorly handled its past stories about trauma, PTSD, and mental health. There's plenty of other YouTubers who have created that content and explained the problems far better than I can, so I will refer you to those content creators, ranging from James Stephanie Sterling to MertKayKay, and others. Needless to say, all of Bloober's games have been about player characters dealing with trauma and/or mental illness, and they all, with maybe the possible exception of their one genuinely good game, Observer, have depicted those people as completely broken, unsalvageable monsters who are a danger to themselves and to society, and whose only recourse should be to kill themselves in order to end their misery and spare others from their awfulness. Plenty of people all over the internet were already skeptical enough of Bloober's ability to adapt Silent Hill's story as it was. But if Bloober is taking creative liberties and changing that story, well, their current track record suggests that that's not going to be a very good sign. And, let's be honest, Konami hasn't exactly imbued us Silent Hill fans with any confidence regarding their ability to competently manage this particular intellectual property, or any of their intellectual properties for that matter. I really hope that Bloober does not do what all of the other Western developers of Silent Hill sequels have done. Like, for instance, they could add some ending in which Mary actually killed James, and James is the one who's been dead all along, confusing or outright negating much of the game's symbolism and metaphor. Or they could add an ending where James didn't kill Mary after all, and so has no reason to feel guilty to the degree that he manifests a purgatory that he secretly desires. Or, still worse yet, they could change the twist to be that Mary wasn't even James's wife to begin with, and that James is just a psychopathic murderer and Mary was just some random unlucky tourist who happened to be in that Lakeview hotel room which James decided to target for a murder spree. And, you know, this is Bloober, so, like, you could probably take a guess why James would probably be an irredeemable psychopathic serial killer. I just can't help but have visions of this remake just lowering Silent Hill down to the same level as the likes of Origins, Homecoming, and Downpour. But hey, I don't know. Bloober's games are always technically impressive. They are much better engineers than they are storytellers. So at the very least, the Silent Hill 2 remake will probably look pretty good and probably also have some cool visual set pieces. The one thing that does seem to give fans hope and confidence in the final product is that some original team members, namely Masahiro Ito and Akira Yamaoka, are working on creature and sound designs respectively for this remake. So hopefully they will know enough to catch mistakes made by Bloober and point Bloober in the right direction. However, I haven't seen anything saying that the original game's director, Masahiro Sobayama, or its original writer, Hiroyaku Owaku, will be collaborating with Bloober. So Bloober has an artist and a musician from the original team, but not its director or lead writer. and I don't know how much, if any, say Ito or Yamaoka have regarding game direction, writing, level design, or gameplay. I've said this before regarding Ito's comments on the canonicity of the first Silent Hills endings and the fate of Sybil, but Masahiro Ito wasn't a writer or director for these games. I don't know what, if any, say he had on the original games outside of creature and environmental designs. If Ito is only contributing new or modified creature designs to the game, or worse yet, is just serving as a rubber stamp for Bloober's designs, and he has no say in the game's story or plot, then he can't even act as a viable check on Bloober going off the rails to begin with. But even if Ito and Yamaoka do have significant say in the game's broader design and story, I'm still not necessarily convinced that they alone can keep Bloober on the right track. Masahiro Ito is a great artist and a valuable contributor to the original games, but he is an artist, he's not a writer. When he comments on art design or symbolism of the creatures, or when he criticized the HD collection's visuals and atmospheric presentation, I take him very seriously as an authority, because those are within his field of expertise as an artist and creature designer. But Ito is not the end-all, be-all when it comes to story, and I don't take his word on the game's broader story as being necessarily or absolutely authoritative. Obviously, I respect his insights into the original game's creation, and his insights will weigh heavily into any conclusions or interpretations that I draw about those games, but I'm not going to automatically accept them as gospel written in stone. He can rubber stamp a creative decision made by Bloober, but still could be wrong about it. Hell, he could personally create an original monster or redesign an existing monster, and I might still disapprove of or disagree with his new designs. Just because an original creator or the original creator modifies their own artistic work after the fact, it does not make them right to have done so, especially in a multidisciplinary, collaborative work like a movie or video game, in which the different people who worked on it might not even necessarily agree on any one particular interpretation. Now, to be clear, I want to emphasize that Bloober's Silent Hill 2 Remake is technically a new artistic work. This isn't quite the same as George Lucas modifying the original Star Wars, which then effectively replaced the original movies. Nor is it the same as Disney stripping out some violence and gore from movies on its streaming platform. A remake does not have to be a one-to-one adaptation of the original material. A great example would be John Carpenter's The Thing, which is sort of a remake of an earlier movie called The Thing from Another World, which was itself a loose adaptation of an even earlier novella called Who Goes There? John Carpenter's The Thing is much closer to being an adaptation of Who Goes There than it is to being an adaptation of The Thing from Another World, but it still deviates considerably from both, and the result is a wholly unique and really damn good sci-fi horror movie which was underappreciated in its day, but which has a cult following now and is one of my personal favorite movies. The 2011 prequel remake, not so much. So yes, Bloober does have the freedom to take creative license to make whatever changes they want to Silent Hill 2. It's their interpretation of the work. But I also have the freedom to dislike those changes and to express that dislike publicly. At the end of the day, I honestly have no idea how this game will turn out, and I won't until it releases this fall, if it releases this fall and doesn't get pushed back to next year sometime. Maybe it will pleasantly surprise us, and I'll end up eating my words. But based on this trailer and Bloober's track record, I'm certainly not holding out hope for a faithful retelling of one of the gold standards of psychological horror in the video game medium. The trailer has already convinced me that Bloober is either not adapting the original story as it was, or their attempts to do so will be far less competent than the original creators. Thanks for watching.